All right, good afternoon. I have quite a few things, so please bear with me. The Secretary General arrived in Paris from Beijing a few hours ago. He is scheduled to meet with the new French President, Emmanuel Macron, very shortly, and then the Secretary General will be on his way to Strasbourg, where he is to address the plenary session of the European Parliament tomorrow morning and give a joint press conference with its President, Antonio Tajani. Those two events will be on the EU Parliament's webcast site, and we will also be able to archive them for your viewing pleasure a little later. Before leaving China, the Secretary General delivered remarks at a roundtable session of the Belt and Road Forum, in which he stressed the importance of recognizing the crucial link between sustainable development and sustaining peace. While poverty, extreme inequality, or the denial of basic human rights may not necessarily directly cause civil war and terrorism, he said they all contribute to a sense of social injustice and greatly increase the risk of instability and violence. His remarks are online. And an update from the Central African Republic. The head of the UN mission there, Parfait Onanga-Yanga, today met with leaders of political parties in Bangui to discuss the ongoing attacks against civilians, mainly in the Muslim community, as well as UN personnel and premises. Parfait Onanga-Yanga said that these deliberate attacks in Bangassou with heavy weaponry seem to have been well planned, as the perpetrators made access very difficult by destroying bridges and blocking all accessible roads to town. The mission also briefed political leaders about ongoing efforts to put an end to the violence and to stabilize the situation in the town, including by reinforcing the presence of additional peacekeepers to neutralize attackers, protect civilians, and facilitate critical humanitarian support to the population. Yesterday, peacekeepers conducted searches and clashes with anti-Balaka fighters in parts of the town, and in parallel, the mission escorted some 250 civilians seeking protection in a mosque to the cathedral, which is being protected by UN peacekeepers. Our humanitarian colleagues also tell us that according to preliminary estimates, 25,000 people out of 35,000 inhabitants of Bangassou will need humanitarian assistance. Meanwhile, clashes also erupted in Bria, in Haute-Koto yesterday, causing the displacement of about 1,000 people to a place near the UN's mission's base, while over 500 have sought refuge at an OCHA compound. In Alindao, in Baskoto, up to 8,500 people have also been displaced by clashes. Unverified figures indicate that up to 100 people may have been killed. OCHA plans to lead an interagency assessment mission there. Meanwhile, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, today expressed grave alarm over the expanding attacks by armed groups against the civilian population in several parts of the Central African Republic, as well as attacks against UN peacekeepers. The High Commissioner warned that violence and rising tensions are spreading to areas that had previously been spared the kind of terrifying violence seen in some other parts of the country. And from Mali, our colleagues of the peacekeeping mission in that country report that their camp in Timbuktu was targeted by a mortar attack yesterday. According to initial reports, 4 peacekeepers and 3 members of the Malian armed forces were injured. 8 shells were reportedly fired in the direction of the airport close to a UN camp. The UN mission condemns the attack and denounces the increasing violence in regions of northern Mali. The mission also calls on signatories of the peace agreement to increase their efforts towards the implementation of the agreement, which is the only way to achieve stability in the country. And the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix, continued his visit to Mali. Earlier today, he was in Timbuktu with the head of the mission, Mohamed Anadif. They visited the Liberian contingent at the site of the attack on May 3rd, in which one of their comrades was killed and 9 others were wounded. Mr. Lacroix paid tribute to the fallen peacekeeper and wished a speedy recovery to the wounded. He also conveyed his solidarity when he met with civilian and uniformed staff members and thanked them for their dedication and sacrifices in very difficult conditions. In Bamako, Mr. Lacroix met with President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta and hand-delivered a letter from the Secretary General encouraging further progress on the agreement, as well as expressing support for the G5 regional initiative. Back here, the Special Representative for Kosovo, Zahir Tanin, briefed the Security Council this morning. He said the situation remains generally stable in Kosovo, but the necessary level of trust between Pristina and Belgrade has been further eroded by irresponsible and inflammatory statements. He also noted that the decision to call for early parliamentary elections in June was a significant development, adding the election to provide opportunities for the renewal of political will and direction, as well as for greater diversity in leadership and representation. His full remarks are online. This afternoon, the Council will meet on its recent mission to Colombia, and that will be followed by close consultations on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and other matters. And on Syria, I wanted to give you an update on the humanitarian situation around Raqqa. And I can tell you that both the UN, working with our partners, are continuing the large-scale humanitarian response to those impacted by fighting and military operations going on in Raqqa. Since March of this year, UN agencies, through local partners, have continued to provide humanitarian assistance to almost 300,000 people, including tens of thousands in camps for internally displaced people. Assistance is basically food and non-food items such as hygiene kits, nutrition and medical treatment, as well as vaccinations. The humanitarian community is continuing to update its operational plans and ready to address humanitarian needs that may arise as a result of the ongoing military operations against Daesh. The UN calls for unconditional, unimpeded, and sustained access to those affected by the fighting in Raqqa, and more broadly, to the 4.5 million people who are still in hard-to-reach areas throughout Syria. Meanwhile, the UN continues to receive disturbing reports of continued fighting and military operations, endangering the lives of civilians in Deir ez-Zor Governorate. Yesterday, airstrikes on Abu Kamals in rural Deir ez-Zor allegedly killed dozens of people, including women and children. And I was asked yesterday about reports of a crematorium in Syria. We cannot independently verify the information about the presence of a crematorium in Sednaya prison. The Syrian government has systematically rejected repeated UN requests to access detention centers and prisons. However, various UN entities have regularly documented and reported on human rights violations in Syria, including torture in the context of detention. We're extremely concerned that thousands of civilians continue to be held in government detention centers and have grounds to believe that they are systematically subjected to cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, including torture and sexual violence. And our colleagues at UNHCR report from Yemen that fighting continues in Taiz Governorate and has now displaced some 50,000 people since the beginning of the year. This is in addition to the 3 million who've already been uprooted since the start of the conflict, of whom 2 million are still displaced and 1 million have returned home to precarious conditions. The agency was able to access Mocha, one of the worst impacted areas in Taiz, 3 times last year, most recently last week, and was able to distribute aid for 6,200 people, in addition to the nearly 70,000 people already reached since the start of the year. And in Hudaida, a UNHCR field team saw a huge spike in humanitarian needs with displaced people living on the streets. The agency is leading an effort to respond to the additional needs in anticipation of intensified fighting in the area. Also in Yemen, our colleagues at OCHA tell us that as of today, the number of suspected cholera cases has exceeded 14,000, with 186 associated deaths. The UN and its partners are delivering supplies to 33 diarrhea treatment centers and health facilities across the country. OCHA will fast-track funds to help contain the outbreak. And the UNESCO Director General, Irena Bokova, today has urged an investigation into the murder of Mexican journalist Javier Arturo Valdez Cardenas. Valdez was the founder and editor of the weekly Ridoche in the state of Sinaloa. He had received the Committee to Protect Journalists International Press Freedom Award for his reporting on crime and drug trafficking. Ms. Bokova said Valdez's death is a reminder of the dangerous conditions in which many journalists exercise their profession, that attacks on them undermine the fundamental human rights to freedom of expression. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the head of the Human Rights Office in that country, Jan Reyarab, said the security situation for journalists and rights defenders in Mexico this year has become, quote, a nightmare with no end in sight, with at least 6 journalists and 3 activists killed in just the first quarter of this year. And more information online. And lastly, UNHCR reports that some 500 people were rescued in the Mediterranean between Italy and Libya. However, around 20 men, women, and children are missing and feared dead. This was over the weekend. And the latest incidents, it's estimated that 1,350 people are now missing or dead in the Mediterranean. Lastly, we say thank you to Iraq for paying its dues in full, which brings us up to 99. Matthew, you win today.
All right.
All right, let's go.
Once again, there's something, because I want to ask you something. We have a couple questions about North Korea. One is, I'm sure you've seen the Fox story about WIPO doing a patent application for North Korea for the production of sodium cyanide, which is banned to be brought into the country. And I know before you'd said it wasn't clear to me if the Secretary General had communicated with WIPO about their use of criminal defamation against journalists. But is this something that concerns him? And I also want to ask you about the UN Federal Credit Union openly soliciting deposits from the mission of North Korea as well as the employees of the mission, despite having previously settled sanctions charges for such activity on another sanctioned country. Do you think that this is consistent with this whole idea of tightening up?
I don't speak for the credit union. They're an independent body. I would agree. I would urge you to question them. On the DPRK and the Fox News report, obviously, I think what's contained in the report is disturbing and demands looking into. The panel of experts, the Security Council panel of experts, as you know, is an independent team reporting to the Council, and they have the prerogative to look into all alleged violations of DPRK sanctions and report to the Council accordingly. I think as noted in the article, the panel's coordinator said the panel will look into the issue, and I think the panel will do its work and report back. And if we will obviously look more directly into the issue as well from our end.
Given that there have been previous allegations and reported retaliation at WIPO concerning activities with North Korea, do you think it's something, do you or the Secretary General think it's something that the CEB or some kind of system-wide, does it need to be reiterated to the UN agencies that these sanctions are important?
The absolute need to respect the sanctions regime, both whether it's from member states or within the UN, I think is clear and should be clear to everyone. Edie?
Steph, on the cyber attacks, is the UN's own IT team doing any kind of investigation to try and figure out where this came from?
We're focusing, I think our colleagues in OICT are focusing in keeping our systems safe. So far, so good, as far as I know. We don't have a mandate or the capacity to try to investigate. So obviously the focus is on ensuring that the UN systems are safe and functioning. Rosalind, and then Masoud.
I wanted to go back to the story about WIPO and DPRK. Is it necessary to go back and amend Security Council resolutions to specifically direct UN agencies to make certain that they too are in compliance with sanctions requirements? And separately, is it possible to prevent North Korea from accessing WIPO, since it is a signatory to the treaty that established this regime under which it was trying to get permission to make sodium cyanide?
On your second question, as you know, WIPO is an independent agency with its own governing body. So I think that is a question that needs to be addressed to them. As I told Matthew, it goes without saying that Security Council resolutions need to be respected by member states and UN entities. We have seen, obviously, in certain cases, the Council has made room for the UN to continue to operate in certain places. But whether or not the Council resolutions need to be amended, that's really for the Council to decide. Masoud.
Thank you, sir. On this so-called Islamic summit being called for by Saudi Arabia when President Trump visits Riyadh, and the United Nations representative is going to be there also. Will the United Nations be able to engage Saudi Arabia in asking it to help it reduce these crises in Yemen, in Syria, and wherever the Muslim world is basically creating these crises. Will Saudi Arabia be able to, will the United Nations be able to engage Saudi Arabia in such a endeavor?
I think the UN is engaging Saudi Arabia. I mean, as you will recall, the Secretary General, one of his early trips abroad was to the region. He met with the king, with the deputy crown prince, with the crown prince. Saudi Arabia is a key player to engage, and we are engaging with them. Ismail ul Sheikh Ahmed was there to discuss Yemen not too long ago, so I don't think there's any question of us not engaging with Saudi Arabia.
So does the Secretary General think that Mr. Trump's visit over there will be beneficial to somehow to mitigate these crises at all?
It's not for me to comment, but obviously, as a matter of principle, we're all for diplomacy, dialogue, and bilateral visits. Mr. Lee.
Ask you about Burundi. There's two things that have happened. One, the intra-Burundian dialogue is over with a move to now amend the constitution. Some people say would allow now for a fourth term for Pierre Nkurunziza. And also a group of the opposition members have written to Mr. Mkapa, very upset that he's asked them to sign a legal waiver to go to the next round of talks, which would basically, they think, allow them to be arrested on what they call trumped-up arrest charges by Nkurunziza, the same issue that took place in Tanzania. So I wanted to know, does the Secretary General's office have a comment on this, or his new part-time envoy, Mr. Kafando?
I don't have anything on Burundi today.
Do you have anything on Cameroon?
Yes. On the Secretary General, and because he had said that he will try and bring about major reforms in the United Nations within the first 3 months of his taking office. Obviously, that is a promise that all the politicians or the international leaders make. Now, in that case, what I'm asking is, what about the Secretary General tackling the crisis like the India-Pakistan dispute, which is festering India-Pakistan dispute, which has been going on forever, and every day 10 or 12 people are being killed, whether soldiers or the population. And similarly, I mean, what is happening in Yemen is absolutely outrageous, and nobody is able to do anything about it. How can the
Masood, with all due respect, I think just about every day from this podium we highlight the unacceptable suffering of the Yemeni people. The Secretary General's envoy, Ismail ul Sheikh Ahmed, continues his work to try to bring the parties to the table. For the suffering to stop, those involved in the conflict, those who have their fingers on the trigger, need to stop. I think from our end, no one is trying to hide or shy away from putting a spotlight on what is going on in Yemen. Every day I talk about it.
No, but what about India and Pakistan? When is why is he so reluctant to talk about India and Pakistan, the festering dispute, where they have nuclear
I don't think
weapons?
it's a matter of reluctance. As I said, he's obviously watching the situation very closely and reiterates his need for the parties to find a peaceful engagement through peaceful solution through engagement and dialogue.
But he does, I'm sure he knows that these two countries almost came to sort of a nuclear
I think
standoff.
the Secretary General is a student of history. He knows what has happened. Ben.
Yeah. Does the SG see it as a positive step that there are reports of interest in greater coordination between the Gulf states and Israel in countering Iran, especially in Syria and Yemen?
That's not something we're going to comment on. Matthew.
This one should be right in your wheelhouse. I just want to.
You don't know what's in my wheelhouse.
Okay, let's see. Yesterday, when the press statement came out condemning the missile launch by the DPRK, there seemed to be a big gap between it being announced to some or by some Security Council members and by your office. So rather than gotcha, I want to know, does your office have monthly meetings with incoming presidents of the council? And
Indeed.
if so, is it possible to have them let you know when something's under silence?
The council is master of its own work. The way it functions is that once a council statement has been approved, we can only put it out once we receive it from the Security Council Affairs Division.
Sure.
That's a procedure to make sure that there's little goes wrong as possible, and that's a procedure we followed. Whatever is announced by member states on Twitter, Facebook, or whatever is beyond my control.
But is there a way? So what was the gap between Uruguay sending it to Security Council Affairs and your office sending it to the journalists here?
I don't know what the gap
Can
was.
we reduce that time?
We try to work as quickly as possible. What I do know is as soon as we get it from Security Council Affairs, we share it.
Was
Thank
it
you.
in your wheelhouse?
That's in my wheelhouse. You were right.
Okay.
Thank you all.